Good morning and welcome once again to Hampstead Synagogue Online. I'm joined today, as you can see, by our Rabbi Dr. Michael Harris, and my co-chair, Madeline Abramson. My name is Gabriel Herman. And this is the summer season that never was. Most of our members go all over the world over this particular time. That's not necessarily possible today. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take all our members on holiday. Over the next 3 weeks, we're going to be visiting different countries. Next week, we're going to be visiting Israel, and the following week, we'll be visiting India. But today, we're going to visit a country which I have never visited, but I've always wanted to, and that is Australia. Now, just to give a little bit of context for the Jewish community in Australia, and if I get anything wrong, we can be corrected by our guests who will be joining us momentarily. The first Jewish residents of Australia were actually convicts from the East End of London, primarily in Victorian times. But it took until 1830 before there was a first Jewish wedding, and that was between Moses Joseph and Rosetta Nathan. Belated enough muzzle tov to them. Jewish immigration came at a time of anti-Semitism, and the Return Services League and other groups publicized cartoons to encourage the government and the immigration minister, Arthur A. Colwell, to stem the flow of Jewish immigrants. The affiliation until the 1930s was mainly Orthodox, acknowledging leadership from the chief rabbi of the United Kingdom. To this day, about 70% of synagogues in Australia are Orthodox. In 1930, a liberal progressive congregation, Temple Beth Israel, was permanently established in Melbourne. The first Australian-born rabbi, Rabbi Dr. John Levi, served the Australian liberal movement, which today is supported by the Sydney-based Union for Progressive Judaism. About 90% of the Australian Jewish community live in Sydney and Melbourne. Melbourne Port has the largest Jewish community of any electorate in Australia. According to the 2016 census, the Jewish population numbered 91,020, of whom 46% lived in Greater Melbourne, 39% in Greater Sydney, and 6% in Greater Perth. The states and territories with the highest proportion of Jews are Victoria, New South Wales, whereas those with the lowest area are in the Northern Territory and Tasmania. The extraordinary economic, political, and social success of the Australian Jewish community have also been attributed to contributing to widespread assimilation. Community success can also be measured by the vibrancy of Australian Jewish media. While traditional Jewish print media is in decline, new media forms such as podcasts, online magazines, and blogs have stepped into the breach. I'd like to thank all those people watching from Jewish News, who are our new media partner for this particular series. And I don't know whether this is being shown in Australia, but at the moment we have a television program called Almost Australian by Miriam Margolyes, who is what we call a Marmite figure. You love her or hate her, or perhaps in Australia she's a Vegemite character, who knows. But what I'm going to do now is transport all of us in Hampstead over to Australia, and I'm going to click my finger and we should be in Australia. Thank you very much. So we've now joined Australia. More particularly, we've joined Sydney, not Sydney in Australia, in Sydney, Australia. We have representing the Great Synagogue, and there actually is a link between Hampstead Synagogue and the Great, which we might allude to later on, and that's Rabbi Dr. Benjamin Elton. So welcome to you. We also have with us Eleanor Levi, and also Sharon Shach, and we'll be introducing the two later on. But first, I'm going to ask the two rabbis if they'd like to kick off our discussions and debates. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. And like Gabriel, I've never visited Australia, although I'd very much like to. So it's wonderful to be in Australia virtually. And thank you very much for allowing us to join with you, our friends in the Great Synagogue. And it's wonderful to see my friend and colleague, Rabbi Dr. Benjamin Elton, who we've known each other for a long time. And I'm going to ask Rabbi Ben a few questions about how things have been have been going. It would be interesting for our members in Hampstead to hear how things have been in Australia, and maybe I can shed some light for our friends in Sydney as to how things have been going here in Hampstead and in London. So Rabbi Ben, can I ask you first, how's the situation in general in Sydney at the moment? We've been reading that Melbourne in particular has been having some really serious difficulties with the COVID situation. How are things now in Sydney?
Well, can I say how nice it is to be here on this broadcast and to see Uriah Harris? Traditionally, at all public events of the Great Synagogue, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Aboriginal peoples who were here before any Europeans arrived in the 18th century. In the case of the Great Synagogue and of my own home in Darlinghurst, which is about 15 minutes walk away, that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And we always acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging. Sydney and the rest of Australia during COVID is really now a developing situation. I think many of us felt that we'd got away with it. Let's say 5 or 6 or 7 weeks ago, there were only, I say only, every death's a tragedy, but compared to the rest of the world, about 103 deaths, nobody below the age of 50, and the numbers had come down to single figures every day. There'd been a couple of outbreaks in old age homes, but really in comparison to the rest of the world, it was an extraordinary deliverance. Personally, in the Great Synagogue, nobody was hospitalized, nobody passed away. I think one person got it in Europe and came back with it and was isolated, and he just recovered. So for most of this COVID period, it was something that's happening elsewhere. In terms of disease and death, I should add, in terms of lockdown, we too were locked down. So from the middle of March until just before Shavuot, there were no services and no in-person activities of any sort. And we really felt the impact of that. Although my daughter's daycare stayed open, most people took their kids out of daycare. So I was at home, my wife was at home, both trying to work from home and looking after our daughter as well, which are more familiar to people in other parts of the world who had to cope with COVID. Now things have developed because of a leak essentially from the quarantining of foreign arrivals into Australia, or even Australians coming back from abroad to Australia. The disease got into the Melbourne community. One person came from Melbourne to Sydney, went to a pub in the southern part of Sydney, and from there it spread out into Sydney as well. So Melbourne's having a very tough time, hundreds of new cases every day. I think at the moment it's about 400 and something new cases a day. It was about 700 new cases a day. They are now in a total and absolute lockdown, including a curfew from 8 p.m. until 5 a.m., only leaving the house for an hour each day. Things are very serious there. And we too have got a couple of extra measures. So whereas before you could have a service with one person per 4 square meters, which for the Great Synagogue would be 260 people, now it's 100 people in total. So we had a bar mitzvah yesterday, and it made a big difference because normally we'd have the Simcha family and their guests and the regular congregation, but we had to, the Simcha guests brought 60 odd people, so we had to restrict our normal members to just over 30 who could attend that particular week, and that's very sad. So we're feeling the pinch, but still, thank God, we're doing better than we might be doing, than we feared we'd be doing, and we hope the measures in Melbourne and in Sydney are successful.
Right, so I can wish you obviously the very best of luck with that. And sorry to hear about the impact on the simchas, which is something that we've had here. In fact, we've had some postponed simchas, so our restrictions are pretty tight. In shul, everyone has to wear a mask, as we were in shul yesterday. We just started last Shabbat Nachamu, with our first Shabbat service back, and I had our second Shabbat service yesterday, and have had at least one bat mitzvah and several weddings postponed. So we wish all the best with that. Tell me how are plans developing for the Yamim Noraim? Do you have any indication of what things will be like, how things will go?
Yes, so essentially we have 750 members, although many more than that turn up on the high holidays because a family of members and former members and people who thought they used to be members all turn up on that day, and we don't have a strict policy of admittance. This year it'll be restricted to members, and if you tot it up, there are about 900 sort of seats over all the services of high holidays. So not counting the evening services of Rosh Hashanah, but Shachris and Musaf on Rosh Hashanah, Mincha on Rosh Hashanah, which for us will be a souped-up version with a sermon with highlights of Musaf and with shofar on the second day, and then Kol Nidrei, Shachris, Musaf, Mincha, and Ne'ilah on Yom Kippur, 100 at each. That gets you 900. And so we're going to say to our congregation, we have said, you will be able to come to at least one service over the holidays. You will have the experience of davening in the shul over the holidays, but probably only once. And we just ask you to understand this is a very special year. I think it would be a mistake to try and delude ourselves or anybody else. This can be anyway like a normal year. It won't be. Please that it will be in 2021, but 2020, our aim is to give everyone who wants the opportunity to daven in shul in what's a very beautiful shul, a very special shul, a unique atmosphere, at least once over the high holiday period. Right,
so we wish you all the very best with that. And obviously we've got many adjustments as well, and a vastly reduced capacity. We think we're probably down to around 200 in the shul at any one time, and the capacity of the shul is around 900. What is the capacity, by the way, Rabbi Ben, of the Great Synagogue?
1,000, 1,100 around that.
Right.
Depends how many extra chairs you put out.
Okay, so very slightly greater capacity than us, and the very best of luck with it. Let me come on to the sad topic of bereavement, Lo Aleinu. May Hashem protect us all from it. How have you found the experience of dealing with community bereavements in this time? I must say, my own experience and the experience of many others in trying to comfort mourners has been two-sided. On the one hand, obviously, one feels extremely sorry for bereaved families that they can't have the physical presence of people beyond the immediate family unit and friends with them at a time when it's very important for them. On the other hand, two, as it were, silver linings that I've noticed have been, number one, at the Levaya, at the funeral, often because of the restrictions on numbers. I don't know if you've got restrictions on numbers, but we have had varying restrictions. I think we're now on 30 restriction of 30 people. There is a more of a focus. Sadly, there is often sometimes something of a social element, even at a Levaya, because inevitably people are seeing each other, haven't seen each other for some time. In this situation, that's all gone, which is welcome, and people are totally focused on the service and on saying farewell to the person who's passed away. So that was kind of one silver. Some families tell me they found the funeral more focused. And at Shiva as well, just Zoom has, of course, allowed people to join together from all over the world, and with unrestricted numbers. And often, I've been officiating at Shiva sometimes with 80 people, 100 people, 200 people, people who you couldn't have physically all got in one room had we been together in a conventional Shiva. How have you found it?
It's very interesting insight that it focuses. So normally in Sydney, the funerals are split site. So there's a Chevra Kadisha in Sydney itself, and then we drive off half an hour to the cemetery just outside Sydney, Rookwood Cemetery, the largest cemetery in the world, which has all the different denominations all within it. Now you can go to the Chevra, but you can only have about 30 people there, which is too few for many people's wishes. So instead they choose to have their funeral at graveside. We can have 100, I think, 100, 150, which is ample for the most part. But you're right, it has reduced that element. One of the anxieties or frustrations of funerals I found is that as the mourners leave the Chevra Kadisha and go down to the pavement behind the coffin, and the coffin goes in the hearse, there's a tendency for them to be swamped by all the people who've come who aren't going off to Rookwood, who aren't going to the cemetery, and this is their opportunity to wish them long life. Whereas what you want them to be doing is walking behind the hearse for a few steps as it begins to drive off, and then really getting in their cars and going off to the funeral, this burial, so we can complete it. And but it's very, very difficult for them to do that, because the custom here seems to be for people to offer a condolence outside the Chevra Kadisha, and that's very disruptive to the whole process. So that now doesn't happen. We just meet at the cemetery, and there've been very large numbers, as large as we've been permitted, and I think it is a more focused service. In terms of Shiva, I've only conducted one Shiva in the home during this period. Most people prefer to come to the shul, and we have the minyan in the shul, and therefore we can have 100 people. So people also zoom in, and previously in Sydney, almost all my funerals were delayed by a day or two because people were flying from Melbourne, because almost everybody has some close family in Melbourne, sometimes Perth as well. That's now not possible, so funerals are happening quicker, and those people in other cities are being zoomed in, but the shul also has capacity, or is permitted to have 100 people still, and so you have quite a substantial minyan in the shul. Minhag Sydney seems to be only to have prayers the first night after the funeral. It's very rare to have more than one night, and it's astonishingly rare to have morning services during a Shiva. Those who wish to pray with the minyan during a Shiva will come to shul in the morning. So that also makes things somewhat easier. There's one night, and I can tell you that when there's one night and it's in a home, because it's the only opportunity people have to come, it can be absolutely jam-packed. So being in the shul, actually, also there's more space. It's less crushed than it often is in a home. So there have been differences, and I think, as you say, some of them are actually more in keeping, I think, with the atmosphere you want around the time of a bereavement.
Right. Thanks very much. That's so fascinating to hear the experiences that you've been having there. I've got many more questions to ask you, Rabbi Ben, but I know that time is moving on. And so if I may, I'm going to stop our conversation there and ask you to introduce Sharon.
Yes. So we have two of our very beloved and valued members with us also this evening for us, this morning for you. It's interesting, there's a real contrast between them, because Eli Levi's family has been part of the Great Synagogue for almost all of its history, going back to the 19th century, which is extraordinary. I performed her marriage 3 years ago, I think, and she was the 6th generation or something to be married in the Great Synagogue from her family, quite extraordinary. And Sharon Shach, who has been the absolute linchpin of our online efforts through her leadership of great women. Essentially, we had two avenues for our online content. One was the rabbis, and the other was great women, putting out an amazing array of different offerings. And she and her husband, Steve, who's the Gabbai of the shul, joined in the last 10 years. So old blood and new blood. So I'll hand over first to Sharon, the new blood.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Elton, for that kind introduction. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with the Hampstead Synagogue community and to share with you the program that the great women of the Great Synagogue in Sydney have been running during our COVID isolation time. Just very briefly, I would like to summarize what Great Women does under normal circumstances, whatever normal is, at our shul. We are the umbrella organization covering all the women's activities at the shul. That includes the Women's Auxiliary, who cater our Kiddushim, also the monthly Rosh Chodesh gatherings, and an annual Women's Weekend event at the shul called WOW, which stands for Women of Worth, as well as the Kaddish class series for women that Rabbi Elton teaches several times a year. When we began social isolation in early March, Caroline Lewis, one of our Great Women's committee members and the chair of the WOW Weekend, expressed some thoughts about developing an online program to connect with our members. I will read to you how we crystallized those thoughts into words and then share with you how we put them into action. So Caroline wrote, "What incredible times we are living in right now. Who would have thought only a month ago that we would be in isolation, unable to attend any social gatherings, be with our friends and family, or attend shul for our happy or sad occasions. Now, staying connected and engaged in society and our community with family and friends is paramount to keeping physically and emotionally safe and healthy, but at a distance and online. In light of this, and because we know that being part of the great family means caring about the we, not the I, Great Women is creating an online group for our community. So that was our brief. And I must add here that other than the Rosh Chodesh conversations, our programs are not restricted to women. We have had many of our men members join us for our sessions. So we then began a frenzied time of planning because there were so many ducks to get in a row. We needed to choose speakers and topics. We needed to set times which did not conflict with other shul online events, as our two rabbis also conduct online events. We needed to get the Zoom platform organized, flyers designed, registrations completed. I've never been as busy as I am during this time. In fact, I said to my husband that when all this official isolation is over, I'm going to isolate myself for a month to recover. The best way, I think, to share with you what our programming has been is to show you a collage of many, but not all, of our event flyers, for which I must give credit to the very talented Ilana Medell, who works in our shul office. So I hope you can see these flyers. Each one of these squares represents a flyer for one of our events. And I'm going to start with our Rosh Chodesh group. And as you can see, scattered throughout this collage, and I've counted them up, there are 5 Rosh Chodesh events. And so that tells us how long we've been doing this isolation. Our Rosh Chodesh group normally meets in person in Abra and Rabbi Phil's home. The groups are run by Rebbetzin Abra Kaplan. And now they are successful Zoom events. These will continue until we're once again able to meet together in person. Abra gives an approximately 20-minute talk on an aspect or aspects of the month ahead, and then opens up for discussion. These have been just wonderful. Another category of presentations is members sharing their life stories. These include events such as our former Great Synagogue President, Roz Fischel, who was the first woman president of a major Southern Hemisphere Orthodox congregation, and Hinda Young, Rabbi Elton's wife, who shared the story of her journey towards finding her Latino roots in America. Simone Green spoke about how her career in nursing triggered her journey to conversion to Judaism, and Jill Samuel elaborated on the theme that everyone has a story, and shared her life, which began in New Zealand, then England, and eventually Australia. Rabbi David Freilich reminisced about his years of growing up at the Great Synagogue. And very recently, we had 3 ladies who all sit in the row in front of me in shul on Shabbat morning, share their stories. And it was amazing how much we learned about each other in an hour online that years of sitting together in shul hadn't brought to light. And our most recent life story was presented by New South Wales Supreme Court Justice Stephen Rothman, our outgoing shul president, who reflected on his 6 years as president of the Great Synagogue, of his extensive involvement in the Sydney Jewish community and the Australian First Peoples, and about his legal career. We've had discussion topics that have been far-reaching and varied. Examples were presentations by Caroline Lewis on how to stay sane when the world seems crazy. Dr. Ellie Friedman, who works with domestic and sexual abuse cases, and she spoke about domestic violence in the times of COVID. Dr. Sue Hertzberg-Brieger, who is an emergency room physician, and spoke about how COVID has impacted her work in the emergency medicine. Lisa Pillemer, who spoke about charitable giving in the age of COVID-19. And Rabbi Elton spoke about why can't women be Orthodox rabbis? Or can they? Rabbi Elton's talk led to a wonderful international session presented by 2 women who recently obtained smicha from Yeshivat Maharat in New York, one here and one in Nashville, Tennessee. And one of our younger members, who's a dietitian working in diabetes research, gave a most enlightening talk on diet and type 2 diabetes and how one diet does not fit all. We've also had several how-to sessions, which have been great fun. I demonstrated dairy dishes before Shavuot. Michael Rantisi, who's an Israeli chef in Sydney, demonstrated several vegetarian dishes and also discussed the huge challenges of being in the restaurant business during this time. And Ilana Modell, who also designed these flyers, demonstrated how to create beautiful grazing platters in her session called Feasting Family Style. The feedback from participants in our sessions has been universally positive. In fact, what we have found is that at the end of each session, there are many who stay on to just sit around and chat. It is so heartwarming. I would like to conclude with just a few words about our Kaddish classes for women. Ever since his arrival at the Great Synagogue, Rabbi Elton has been a tremendous supporter of women's participation in services to the extent that it is halachically permissible. Women can and do say Kaddish, so it was with much anticipation that our first series of Kaddish classes for women taught by Rabbi Elton was launched last November. Because of the personal and often moving nature of the classes, registration was limited to 10 participants, and the first series of 4 weekly classes held in my home was instantly filled. It was an extraordinary success. We then had a second series at the shul, which was equally successful. We had grateful and very moving feedback from all participants. We were well into planning a third series when COVID-19 put a stop to that. This was really not felt to be an event that lends itself to online participation. However, there was a huge demand for another class, and so Rabbi Elton and I discussed it and decided that we would hold the classes at the shul with appropriate distancing, of course, but that if any woman preferred to join via Zoom, we would do it. So last week, we began the series with 7 women at the shul and 7 at their own homes. It worked well, and once again, we showed how well we can adapt to these crazy times. In conclusion, I would like to thank the Hampstead Synagogue and your organizers for inviting me to speak at this unique event. Thank you to all the guests for your attention, and if you have any questions to pop into the chat, I'd be delighted to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharon. That was really very upbeat and exhilarating to hear all that's been going on at the Great. I think it's been replicated by communities right around the world. It's been a very interesting and exciting and rather dynamic part of all what's happened. And what I think I was struck by, that you sat behind some people in shul and learn more about them in this particular situation than you've done previously. So there's something very special going on. We're doing it now, of course, and we had a comment come in from Naomi Michaels. Does anybody know her cousin Alex Water in Sydney? Oh, we got a nod. Okay.
Is he not in our choir, Rabbi Elton?
That's right. He's a very dedicated member of the shul choir, and I performed the Pidgin Haben for his first grandson, of course, a couple of years ago, which was a rare treat.
It's a small world, then, isn't it? We might be halfway around the world, but there we are. And interesting, because you have a very strong choral tradition in the Great, don't you? Obviously, that presumably has been suspended for the duration. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm afraid so. So when we first came back, choirs were permitted, and the choir sang while wearing masks and at a 2-meter distance from each other. With the outbreak in Melbourne, choirs were not permitted anymore, and so there's no choral service. But we've had a choir for as long as the synagogue has been standing, and they never sing during the high summer, which for us is at the end of December to the beginning of February. So we are used to it. We have a taste of a non-choral service every year, but we're not used to it in August.
I had to get my head around that, because your summer is our winter and vice versa. I keep forgetting this. So that's rather fascinating. Now, there is a connection between our 2 synagogues. We had a minister called the Reverend Raymond Apple, who then became our very first rabbi, because he got samicha and was able to use the title for the very first time at Hampstead. And then he left us to go to you.
That's right. So both Rabbi Harris and I are successors to Rabbi Apple, who K'nai Nahara is still well and still busy writing and researching in Jerusalem. And it's been a very powerful support for me. If I ever need to know about an aspect of the Shul's Minhag, then I get in touch with Rabbi Apple and he can tell me. And so there's a real connection. Also, in terms of the mixed choir, so the Rabbi Apple was always frustrated there was a mixed choir at Hampstead, but never got it disbanded. He came to Sydney on the condition that the mixed choir at the Great Synagogue would be disbanded, and he won't mind me telling this story. He gave them a year to disband the choir. After that year, they said, I'm sure the rabbi's forgotten all about this idea, at which point he stood up and left the meeting, and he said, either the mixed choir goes or I do. And they kept the rabbi and they lost the choir.
Yeah, well, we were the very last London Orthodox congregation to lose our mixed choir, so there were still fights going on for long after Rabbi Apple left us. Okay, so what I think we'll do now is take a short commercial break, and when we come back, we'll have some more questions and discussion and introduce you to Ellie. So let's take a short break now. Welcome back. And yes, that's the US.TV. That's the television channel for the United Synagogue. And some of our archive material can be found there. So do check it out, as will this series as well. So Ellie, welcome to you. Ellie, you are a former editor of the Sydney Jewish Report. And I understand that you'll be talking about visiting Sydney and what to see and do once international travel returns. Over to you, Ellie.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having us. So as Rabbi Elton mentioned, I was fifth generation in my family to get married at the Great Synagogue 3 years ago. And I think we'd been around at the Great Synagogue for at least 6 generations. And my daughter, Reva, was named at the Great Synagogue last year as the 7th generation, which is very exciting. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which Sharon, Rabbi Elton and I live today. For me in Bondi, that's the Bidjigal people. For Rabbi Elton in Darlinghurst, as he mentioned earlier, that's the Gadigal people. And for Sharon across the Harbour Bridge in Milson's Point, that's the Cammeraygal people. These are all clans within the Eora Nation, and I would like to pay my respects to all their elders past, present and emerging. I believe I've also got some images to show if they're able to come up. If not, I'm happy to kind of create the visual picture myself. Amazing. So this is an aerial shot from Sydney. So please God, when we're all able to travel again, this should be one of the first sites you see when you fly in. Of course, the famous harbour. And we can go to the next slide. Acknowledgement of country, which I just did, is an important way that we pay homage to modern Australia's Indigenous foundations. And throughout Sydney, our city really does display its heritage and history as well as its modern trimmings. So today I'd like to take you through a few of the many sites that make up the visually very pleasing tapestry that is Sydney. Next slide. So we'll start in the central business district, the CBD, on Gadigal land, where the Great Synagogue is located. Of course, the Great is itself an incredible sight to behold when you visit Sydney, please God, soon. Coming for a tour during the week or attending Shabbat services is a must. And near the Great are many of Sydney's prized tourist spots. A short walk takes you to the famous harbour, but on the way there are a couple of things to see. We'll go to the next slide, please. You can stop in to see the State Library of New South Wales. Part of the complex is the Mitchell Library, a heritage-listed building which opened in 1910. Every wall is lined with books, as you can see. The ceiling is stunning and it brings in a lot of natural light. I personally spent many Sundays there during university and would always see tourists popping their heads in. Across the road, we'll go to the next slide, please, is the Royal Botanic Garden, an oasis in the middle of the usually very busy and loud CBD. There are beautiful native plants throughout the gardens, as well as guided tours, including Aboriginal heritage tours. And we'll go to the next slide to take us down to the harbour. So that we've got the famous Sydney Harbour Bridge and the Sydney Opera House. These sites really need little to no introduction, but I'll present a few facts that you might not already know. It took 1,400 workers 8 years to build the Sydney Harbour Bridge, and 16 lives were unfortunately lost in that process. Homes of up to 800 families living along the path of the bridge were also demolished. And interestingly enough, I found during my preparation for this presentation this fact, and those families actually weren't compensated at all. So for the good of the city and to join two parts of the city, they were moved along. The bridge is one of only 2 bridges in Australia that can legally be climbed. The other is Brisbane's Story Bridge up in Queensland. And the Sydney Opera House was opened by Queen Elizabeth II on the 20th of October 1973, and she is visited 4 times, most recently in 2006. Arnold Schwarzenegger, former actor and governor of California, won his final Mr. Olympia bodybuilding title in 1980 in the concert hall of the Opera House. So the Opera House is known for many performances, but probably not many people knew about that particular part of the program. So after snapping a few pictures in front of these 2 iconic structures, the next place to visit is the Rocks. And we'll go to the next slide for that one, please. This precinct is where the first British colonisers, convicts, soldiers and sailors first lived from 1788. Today, the cobbled laneways remain and the area offers markets, museums, pubs and walking tours. Pictured on the left is actually a picture from after my husband Ezra's and my wedding at the Great Synagogue, and we took a stroll through that part of town and had some photos in those very cute laneways. In contrast to the area's colonial aesthetic is the Museum of Contemporary Art, Australia's home of contemporary art. And we can see that on the next slide. And that is a place that has incredible exhibitions, some amazing contemporary art from here and around the world, and I would highly recommend that. We'll go on to the next slide, please. Also in the CBD are 2 more attractions that I'll mention before moving a little further afield. So we have the Art Gallery of New South Wales. This gallery offers collections showcasing both Australian and international art. There are permanent collections as well as more than 30 temporary exhibitions annually. One of the most famous annual exhibitions is the Archibald Prize, which is a portrait prize. And I believe they're actually about to start taking entries for it. And I heard the curator on the radio the other day saying that it was, of course, a very challenging year, but it seems that most of the artists were able to actually get in the room in a socially distanced way with their subjects. So this very famous and much loved exhibition can still take place. And we'll go to the next slide, please, to look at one of Sydney's newer tourist attractions, which is Barangaroo. So this whole area is a new hub for business, retail, dining, and it really is taking in the harbour from another perspective. Barangaroo Reserve marks the transformation of Sydney's industrial harbour foreshore into a sprawling 6-hectare parkland. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the origins of the name Barangaroo, which are fascinating. Barangaroo is named after a powerful Camaragial leader of the Eora Nation at the time of European colonisation. She was one of the clan who lived in and around the North Harbour. Barangaroo refused to wear European clothes or drink their wine. When she did visit the colony with her husband Bennelong, after whom Bennelong Point, the site of the Sydney Opera House, is named, she was dressed up with a bone through her nose and painted herself with white clay, a proud statement of her spirituality and culture. She was a hunter and provider for her clan and fiercely independent. Today, Aboriginal contemporary culture is celebrated at Barangaroo through artworks, events and commemorations, including NAIDOC Week and the popular black markets. And we'll go to the next slide, please. So right near the CBD is the Sydney Jewish Museum, which collects and conserves original memorabilia related to the Holocaust, Judaica and Australian Jewish history to make these available for display and research for generations to come. The Sydney Jewish Museum was established in 1992 by Holocaust survivors who envisaged the museum as a place which could hold their stories and personal objects, memorialise those who were murdered during the Shoah, and within which lessons from the past would be taught. Today, the museum continues to give a voice to the victims of the Holocaust so their stories can start conversations and inspire change. It really is an important place to visit and is a hub of education about the Holocaust and Jewish history for Jewish and non-Jewish students alike. I think there really isn't a student who goes through school here, whether they go to a Jewish school or not, who doesn't go to the Jewish Museum. So it's a fantastic resource for educating the whole community. And lastly, worth mentioning further afield in Bidjigal land is Bondi, where I live. Thank you. And the world famous Bondi Beach. The famous beach is buzzing from dawn to dusk, when we're not in strict lockdown, of course, with surfers, swimmers and sunbathers. Between May and November, you can spot whales during their annual migration from one of the spectacular vantage points from Bondi to the Coogee Coastal Walk, which is a 6-kilometre trail which links 4 beaches. In late spring, the cliffs of the coastal walk are transformed by Sculpture by the Sea, which is the world's largest annual free-to-the-public outdoor sculpture exhibition. A year-round events calendar highlights the festivals, activities and attractions that are held in Bondi throughout the year, including the Festival of the Winds, which is a kite festival on the beach itself, and Bondi Beach Latin American Festival and Flickerfest, a short film festival at the Bondi Pavilion. And so I hope you've enjoyed the Taste of Sydney. We'll go on to the next slide just to wrap up. There are so many more sights and sounds to explore. And while travel is restricted due to COVID, many of the places I mentioned and more actually have online accessibility. So I wanted to mention that. There's a platform called Google Arts and Culture, and you can do a 360-degree virtual tour of the Sydney Opera House at your own pace, as well as access online exhibitions from the Art Gallery of New South Wales, the Australian Museum, Bondi Sculpture by the Sea, the Museum of Contemporary Art, and more. So we hope to welcome you to the Great Synagogue and to Sydney soon, and thank you so much for having me this evening.
Ellie, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for that. And I mentioned it earlier that Miriam Margulies had that program called Almost Australia, and Australia is like no other country. It's so different in different locations. And I just wondered whether you could give us a little taste or a little hint about other opportunities of visiting Australia outside of Sydney.
Sure. I mean, probably Melbourne and Canberra are the places that I know best besides Sydney. So Melbourne, obviously, as mentioned earlier, also has a very large Jewish community, and their Jewish community, interestingly, is a lot more centralised. So there are a few suburbs, like you mentioned, the electorate that they're in has a large Jewish community, and they're a lot more centralised than Sydney is. We have mainly 3 large areas where there are Jewish communities, whereas in Melbourne they are a bit more centralised, as I said. So again, Melbourne has an incredible cafe culture like Sydney does, but they're particularly also famous for kind of laneways with cute cafes and great coffee. They also pride themselves on their history and heritage and have many sites like that to explore. There are lovely synagogues and old synagogues as well to explore, just as you would explore in Sydney those. And Canberra, our nation's capital, which was interestingly established because Sydney and Melbourne couldn't agree on which one would be the capital. So they had to create one. Sort of, it was meant to be in the middle, but it is a little bit closer to Sydney. And that has, of course, our Parliament House, a big war memorial, and many other sites, as well as a thriving Jewish community. So that's kind of a taste of what you might experience. And as I mentioned before, up in Queensland, where you'll find beautiful weather in the Great Barrier Reef, and definitely also well worth a visit.
And something unsettling is happening with all those forest fires were recently. And I couldn't believe that the size of it was quite enormous. People must be very worried about that, and it must be dealing a lot of problems with the local ecology and economy of the outside of the major cities. How serious is it, and is it going to get worse, do you think, or is this under control now?
Fires have definitely always been, and bushfires have always been a part of the Australian landscape, but they have been getting worse, and the records and the statistics do show that. Each summer we seem to be breaking records for the hottest summer, we seem to be breaking records for large fires and the most destructive fires, which is obviously just devastating for, as you mentioned, the natural environment, the people who live in those areas. And this particular past summer was especially bad, and we felt the effects in the city. Obviously nothing like the effects that the people who actually live on those lands were experiencing, but the air quality in Sydney, I think at various points became the worst in the world, and we were living through that. So our kind of self-isolation, especially for someone like myself who had a young baby at the time, started a long time before COVID, a few months before that, where we were kind of staying indoors and really restricting where we would go out because the air quality here was really bad. The smell of smoke in the air was very vivid. And yeah, it is definitely, with the onset of climate change and without proper action from government, we will see those effects getting a lot worse, and they are already devastating to the communities there. On top of those communities also getting floods, and the other, extreme weather impacts that Australia's country is known for, but that are only getting worse year by year.
I mean, I heard that the size of the problem was the size of Wales, which is quite incredible. Right. Sharon, do you travel around Australia, and what would be some of the highlights that you could think of?
We do, and our favorite place in all of Australia is Tasmania. That small island just south of Melbourne, on the way down to the South Pole. It is absolutely beautiful. They're just wonderful drives. It's all scenery. That is what its main attraction is for tourists, is scenery, and they have a lot of farming there, so they have wonderful foods, and that is our absolute favorite. But the other wonderful area that we've been to is up north, the Kimberley, where you can either travel on land through the Kimberley, or you can cruise along the Kimberley coast. And they have wonderful rock formations that are millions and millions of years old. In fact, they are so old that they predate any type of life. So there are no fossils in those rocks because they're that old. And then, of course, there's, as Ellie mentioned, there's the Great Barrier Reef. And then if you go west, there's Perth and Western Australia, the Margaret River area, and into the center of the country where Alice Springs, Uluru, which is a very sacred place for the Aboriginal people as well. So we sure hope that everybody will be able to come here. There's so much to see and do.
Thank you for that. Rabbi Elton, if I can bring you in. I suppose it can be quite difficult to be Jewish in certain parts of Australia outside of the major cities. So how does one cope traveling long distances, getting kosher food, or linking to other Jewish people?
You go prepared. So when my wife and I have gone to different places, the smoked salmon and the hummus goes in the cooler, and off we go. Although kosher food does crop up in different places, so in Cairns by the Great Barrier Reef, there's actually kosher food in the supermarkets, even though there's a very small Jewish community up there. There is what's known as Chabad of Rara, which is rural and regional Australia, which does very important work for the outlying communities. But really, the communities is so based in the cities, there's actually very little permanent Jewish presence outside of those cities, which was not always the case. So a funny fact about the Great Synagogue is that when it was built, there were over 900 seats, but there were only 500 members, because another 400 plus people would come in from all the towns around New South Wales, where the Jewish family in the town ran the dry goods store or some sort of other facility catering to the workers of that area. and they would come into the city for the high holidays, and they'd fill up the synagogue, and then they'd go back to their rural area for the rest of the year, unless there was, let's say, a bar mitzvah. I have an extraordinary experience. There was a gentleman called Ellis Goldberg, who was from Tasmania, and he was bar mitzvah in the early 1930s by my predecessor, Rabbi Cohen, who was a writer in 1905. That's a real link with the past. But he was sent from Tasmania to spend a year in Sydney to prepare his bar mitzvah. He was bar mitzvah, then he went back to Tasmania, and then he returned as an adult when he sort of got married and settled in Sydney. But his story was one of that rural to metropolitan relationship of coming in as necessary and then going back to make a living.
We got a message, by the way, that said Sydney Sider, living in Manchester in the United Kingdom. Thanks for the tour, by the way. I had my bat mitzvah at the Great Synagogue. So it doesn't know when that happens, but it could have been it's a long bit of schlap to come from Manchester United for a bat mitzvah.
But very much worth it, Gabriel.
Oh, maybe so. And also, I was struck by the international aspect of people watching this broadcast. Sharon Abramson was writing from Sweden. She says, "Good morning from Sweden." I'm not sure about the time delay difference in there. I was in Sydney 5 years ago and loved your city. Sharon, if you're still watching, get in touch and maybe we'll visit you, visit Sweden in the 4th week of August. Okay, if you want to host us, we'd be more than delighted to meet the Jewish community from Sweden. So I think this has been an absolutely, 1983 we were told, for the bat mitzvah. So that wasn't too long ago. Okay, so I think unless there's anything else that we need to say or do, I would like to start to wrap up. Is there anything that Sharon or Eli you wanted to mention or say? No, I'm getting. And Rabbi, you're okay?
Well, we just want to wish the Hampstead community the best and good health, and hope we all get safely to the other side.
Thank you very, very much indeed. It's a very strange experience for us all over the world, and I think us being able to speak to Australia, which I don't think we've ever done before, is a fantastic thing that we've done. And to share our experiences and hopefully to make new friends is going to be really a wonderful thing. We should keep this going. Sharon Abramson was a member of St John's Woodshaw, which is our neighbouring shtetl up the road here. So it's a very small Jewish world. It really is. Okay, so I think what I'm going to do now, if I may, is to bring in Madeleine Abramson, who's my co-chair here at Hampstead. And Madeleine, over to you.
I'm just going to say thank you. So on a personal note, my husband and I had planned to go to Australia this coming winter. Clearly that's not going to happen, but you, Ellie, have certainly whetted my appetite, because when we first looked at it, I wasn't sure where to go. Now we have got a definite path, and please God, that will happen soon. Sharon, I felt that you really have a wonderful program for women at the Great Women at the Great Shul, and you've inspired me to extend what we do for our women, and I know Rabbi Harris would support that. So we will have a look at a program for the Great Women of Hampstead now. So thank you very much. And Rabbi Dr. Benjamin Elton, it was lovely to hear from you and to hear the difficulties that you have gone through in Australia, very similar, obviously, to what happens here in the UK and the world over. And it is a real reminder that this is a worldwide pandemic. It's not going to go away in a hurry until, please God, we can find a vaccination. And hopefully Sydney and Melbourne will be back up and running fully shortly, as hopefully will be the UK. So thank you very much. Been very interesting to have you on board, Australia. And our thanks also to our technical team here, Leo Mindell, and to Gabriel for putting this program together. And to Rabbi Harris for participating with us today. And to our media partners, the Jewish News, this is our first session with them, but the sessions will continue. So next Sunday at 11 o'clock, we will be with Israel. And although Israel may be a familiar destination to many of you, I'm sure we will have more information and new things to show you next Sunday at 11 o'clock. That's the 16th. And then on the 23rd, we will be visiting India, which is not a traditional location to look at the Jewish side of India. So that should also be very interesting. So thank you very much, everybody, for participating today. Thank you for those who are watching and listening. We hope you've had a great session. And Gabriel, unless you've anything else you need to add, that's it. Farewell and thank you, Australia. Good night.